Hello and a warm welcome. You're tuned in to my YouTube station, Smita Sharma Journalist. And right at the outset, a gentle reminder, if you do like the content that I regularly upload here, please do like, share, subscribe, and importantly, press on the bell notification so that you are aware of new content that I am putting up here. And we're going to continue with our focus on the West Asian situation because there's also that larger question really emerging of world leadership today as we watch it, as we see it, because if that endless cycle of violence continues, you do have a problem and a real serious problem when it comes to the kind of leadership on display, whether it's the United States, whether it's the Arab world, whether, of course, the Israelis themselves or the Palestinians, for that matter. Where does this cycle of violence really end? At the moment, what we do know is that Israel has begun its ground offensive starting Monday late night into Lebanon as well, where we saw those airstrikes killing Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, also another spate of leaders. Israel continues to say that it's only targeting the Hezbollah operations and the buildings out there, which they claim are headquartered and occupied by Hezbollah leaders. But what's happened in Palestine, in West Bank, in Gaza, now in Lebanon, these are raising serious questions. At the moment, we are also hearing reports, the US journalists, in fact, actually saying that there are indications, US sources saying that perhaps Iran will be launching a ballistic missile attack soon towards Israel, and a lot of statements going back and forth. To understand the current situation and really look at it from a larger perspective of what I said was the leadership crisis, I'm joined here by somebody who has written a fascinating book on leadership, and it's called Warriors, Rebels, and Saints, The Art of Leadership from Machiavelli to Malcolm X. Professor Moshik Temkin, he has been a distinguished professor of history of leadership, a course that he designed and really, sort of delved into, particularly at the Harvard School of Kennedy, the Kennedy School in Harvard University, and also took it across universities. He's also been teaching at the Kautilya School of Public Policy in Hyderabad. Professor Temkin, many thanks for joining me here in this conversation.
Well, thank you for having me on.
If I could start by getting a sense from you in terms of the crisis right now, before we also look into some aspects of the US presidential elections and talk about your book too. On 25th of September, you put a post on X on Twitter saying the media will portray what's happening in Lebanon as a war between Israel and Hezbollah and downplay the real story here, which is that thousands of civilians, families with children are going to be massacred in Israeli bombings because world leaders are unwilling to step in. And, taking in, of course, from the idea of leadership that you also talk about, the evolution, the quintessential question that you ask in all your classes of whether leaders make history or history makes leader. Your sense right now of what you are seeing in this cycle of conflict, in this cycle of crisis, do you see it ending anytime, or do you see it becoming an endless loop?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's the latter. It already is a seemingly endless problem of warfare, of death, of attacks and counterattacks, and suffering on all sides. And that's been going on for quite a while now. Of course, in the past year, it's become the real crisis point. Really, October 7th, of course, was when Hamas attacked Israel and specifically Israeli civilians. This was considered a tipping point. And then things accelerated after that. Of course, then after that, we had the very massive Israeli attacks, mostly air bombing, but then also military invasion into Gaza, which really brought to the fore a crisis and a conflict that has been going on for a very long time, decades, in fact, if not longer. So I think we are in this, I wouldn't be worried about an endless conflict. We are in an endless conflict. We're already in it. Then the question is, where's the leadership in all of this? And that's where that tweet came from, because none of this happens in a vacuum. It's not just confined to Gaza, Israel, and Lebanon, although those are already important places. But this happening in a global context, a geopolitical context, in which we have world powers. And I'm thinking specifically of the United States. I'm thinking about European Union nations, and of course, powerful nations in Asia as well, who are in my view, not pulling their weight when it comes to really enforcing, at least, if not a permanent peace, which is difficult to achieve, some kind of ceasefire or some kind of situation that allows for diplomacy and talks, from which then after that, you can proceed to maybe a solution that would not bring back, it's not the first time that Israel has invaded Lebanon. You just mentioned it, the ground forces. It's an invasion. They invaded in 2006. They invaded in 1982. And by the way, the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, which came at the end of a civil war in Lebanon, was the origins of Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's when Hezbollah was born in Lebanon.
That's right.
The 2006 invasion in Lebanon also, it ended very badly. So if history teaches us anything, it's actually to be wary of this and not think that, they're doing something for the first time. They're actually seem to be caught in this loop, which is a tragic one. Now, specifically about Lebanon, I wrote about the massacres because you point out, yes, Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah in South Lebanon. But the way they killed him is he wasn't assassinated in the street, or that they dropped 80 bombs.
Yeah, so it wasn't really a targeted assassination.
It was targeted in the sense that they knew that he was in a bunker under these buildings, but they bombed, as far as we know, 6 apartment buildings were bombed. Imagine that someone decided, just for the sake of your viewers, let's say that an enemy of India decided that there is an Indian terrorist hiding in a bunker under 6 apartment buildings in Delhi. And their Air Force would just level 6 apartment buildings with all the people who live inside them, most of whom probably don't know that there's someone living underneath in a bunker, in order to kill that one person. And then, so you would have hundreds of people dead, civilians, and this person would also be killed. And then you would see the world kind of celebrate this very targeted killing, and you would say, wait a minute, what about all these innocent people who died? So I understand the prerogatives of warfare, and I understand the idea that there are certain people that you want to target because you see them as illegitimate actors or dangerous or violent actors. What I find very difficult to digest as a historian, as someone who looks at these world affairs, is the idea that all the human beings who live around there, their lives are worthless, all for the purpose of killing one person. I can't accept that, and I don't think any sovereign country could accept that. I don't think any, whether it's India or America or Israel or Lebanon, that you just, you target another country targets one person and is willing to kill hundreds of people for that. And that's also, unfortunately, what has been happening in Gaza in the past year, because it's true that there were the Hamas operatives were there hiding in Gaza, but there are millions of people living in Gaza, including children who have nothing to do with Hamas, or certainly not responsible for what they did, who have died in the past year. And I think the more people are killed, the more we are in a process of dehumanization. We see people's lives as basically worthless in the context of war. And that is very, very dangerous. It's dangerous for everybody in the end.
In fact, I was going to actually lead into this question because, it is absolutely tragic, unfortunate that to bring home the horror of the Israeli action, we are having to compare deaths. We are having to say that, look, there were 1,200 Israelis who were killed in that horrific October 7th attack. There are more than 41,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza alone in the last 1 year. There are, more than 700 killed in those Lebanon airstrikes on Friday. But do you think that we are currently in a phase, in our contemporary politics and history, where the dehumanization of societies and leadership is at a level which is way more than perhaps when you compare it in the past? Because every time you have these number of deaths put out, you will have this entire argument being thrown into your face. oh, they were surely being used as body shields. Oh, they surely knew that they were living in Hezbollah neighborhoods. Oh, the Palestinians, of course, were there trying to protect the Hamas operatives. So, if you are a sympathizer of Hamas, Hezbollah, you might as well just get killed. That kind of dehumanization, is it also trickling in right from the leadership level itself to society, or how is it working really?
Yeah, that's a good and complex question. A couple of things I would say to that. One is I don't believe that there is any such thing as human shields. I believe that there are human beings. I don't think humans are ever shields, that there is no such thing. So to call people human shields is already to treat them as something that is in a way not human already. You're taking away their humanity and you're turning them into shields. Now, even if you designate someone as you say that they're being used as human shields, how could that possibly justify killing them? So this sounds to me like a cop-out, an excuse. And also, it's a very slippery slope. People are going to start, and governments, states, militaries are going to start deciding that all bets are off and there are no more red lines. International law, by the way, forbids these kinds of attacks. For example, even the pager attacks in Lebanon, those are forbidden by international law because you are targeting people who are in the middle of civilian populations. It could go off in a market, it goes off in a public place, in someone's house, and you're killing everybody around them or maiming them or injuring them. So once you go down that slope and you start justifying massive attacks on civilians because you say, oh, there is a Hamas operative hiding there, then what's to stop others from doing the same to you and saying, well, there was a criminal who was wanted by, I don't know, Interpol hiding and I'm just going to bomb your house because he was in the vicinity. I just don't see, people have a little bit of a tunnel vision. They don't realize the danger of this until it hits close to home, right? It's happening far away, so maybe it seems abstract, but that's why I gave the example of Delhi. People in Delhi wouldn't possibly imagine, or New York City, or anywhere in the world where you're sitting in your house with your children, and all of a sudden there's a bomb dropped on your house, because unbeknownst to you, there is a terrorist hiding in the bunker under your building. Think about that. That's actually quite insane, right? From the perspective of a normal, regular person who is not involved in this kind of warfare. So maybe I'm a bit of a softie, but I refuse to go down that road. And I also think you're right to point out that things have changed. In fact, I would argue that not since the worst eras of war, the World War II, certainly the colonial period, which was full of bloodshed and dehumanization of people who were considered inferior, and therefore their deaths in the thousands or millions was seen as a small price to pay for things that powerful states or empires wanted to achieve. We are seeing a bit of a return to that, and I think a lot of it is due to the priorities changing. I do think that in, let's say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the world was far from perfect, but there was far more sensitivity to the importance of international law, international standards, protection of civilians. I remember cases in which, of course, civilians were targeted. For example, in the war on terror, it happened in the Middle East and in other parts of the world, there was a lot more attention, I think, and a kind of pushback and a criticism of the attacks or targeting of civilians. And now I feel that we're entering into an era where the most powerful have a much more casual and blasé attitude towards this. And I'm thinking, and I'm looking now particularly at Western countries, which are the ones who have the liberal democratic traditions in sort of it at their core. They are the ones who, in fact, have been hammering this issue of international law for many, many decades. And when the world looks at what's happening, they say, well, where is the international rules-based order now? There seems to be no red line whatsoever.
Yeah, and actually, I wrote an article yesterday. Readers can look it up on Deccan Herald. The viewers can look it up, where I argued that the global duplicity, particularly the Western nations, on display here when it comes to the West Asian crisis. And when you compare it with the other scenarios where, of course, there are known US, the non-allies of US or the enemies of US are involved, whether it's China, the Russia-Ukraine war. And, with the disclaimer that, of course, I have been very critical of the Russian, in fact, invasion into Ukraine. And we have somebody who's always maintained that India should have categorically condemned it, even as a close, trusted partner. But the Western response is just so much more directed, essentially, when it sermonizes about democracy, when it sermonizes about human rights, whether it's actually an enemy in concern or question, or whether it's a close ally in question, whether it's a Saudi and an Israel or a Russia or a North Korea or Iran. So having said that, the problem is that who comes in and fills in that leadership gap? Or is a morality compass a completely dead thing now when it comes to global leadership? Because everybody wants to talk about realpolitik. People like me who talk about a moral compass, I think, are looked at from a prism of naivety.
I agree. I think we're in an era where people who talk about the ethical dimensions of the moral dimensions of warfare and even all these very basic issues, which I don't consider radical at all. They used to be very mainstream, almost conservative positions of separation between combatants and civilians, for example, that came out of the trauma of World War II, historically speaking. That World War II was the lesson where we were going to create a world in which, the civilian populations were going to be protected. And hopefully there would be no war. But if there were a war, we would really make sure that the sorts of genocides and the sorts of mass deaths that the world saw in World War II would not repeat itself. And I think that was the basis for the so-called rules-based liberal, however you want to call it, international order that was really led by the West and upheld by the West during the Cold War and after that. That seems to be in complete erosion. And I think what the world now witnesses is that it's all about power. In fact, as you point out, the human rights standards are really applied selectively, right? They're applied to when I say our, let's say the West, our enemies, but not to our friends and allies. Then in that case, we're going to be much more forgiving and sometimes even supportive of what they do internally. And so I think that people around the world certainly observe this, and they are not fooled by this. And they say, wait a minute, in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you were all outraged about targeting civilians and infrastructure and bombing a hospital, bombing a school, that sort of thing. And now, and it's happening a different part of the world where it's your ally that is doing this, and suddenly it's all well, all is allowed in the name of the war that they're conducting. So I think that we have to remember that Israel is a sovereign state, and as a sovereign state, it has the right to not be attacked, to expect peace and security. But we also have to remember that other countries around are also sovereign states. So an invasion of Lebanon, let's say, is no more legitimate than an invasion of Israel. This is, I think, the part of the double standard that we see in a lot of the world, where there are some countries that are more sort of considered at a sort of higher level, that we are more sensitized to their when they are victimized and when they are attacked than to others. And I'm in that way maybe a little bit again out of the mainstream and a little bit naive. Again, maybe it comes from my perspective as a historian. I try not to look at things through a national or nationalist lens. I try to look at things, as much as I can as an observer, and to treat everyone on an equal basis and fairly, and to try to adjudicate and assess, right, how things developed historically. And here what I see is that there is a core issue that never seems to be addressed. And this is the major failure of leadership that I see. And the failure of leadership is all-encompassing, and it's worldwide. It's the failure to address the Palestinian problem, which is that at the end of the day, now as 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and before, The Palestinian people still do not have self-determination. They don't have an independent state. They have a resentment of Israel, which is, in their view, occupying their lands, the West Bank especially, and blockading Gaza, where Palestinians live, and also keeping millions of Palestinians outside of the country in a kind of permanent diaspora. They can't return to where they come from originally. And this is a national conflict that is at the heart of this problem. It is at the heart of the problems with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with this war that we are seeing now. And I think that it's a long time, should have happened a long time ago, that the international community put an end to this problem by creating a just peace in the Middle East, or in West Asia, as you call it, that would, I'm not saying that it would create a utopia, but I believe as a historian that there are historical roots to contemporary problems, including the worst problems. And we have to address the problem at the root. And I think that this is a failure of leadership at the highest levels. I'm thinking of the United States. I'm thinking of European nations like Britain and France and Germany. I'm thinking of even major Asian states like China and India, which have been, in my view, both, I know they're very different and don't get along, but they're very similar in that they're thinking, both of those latter countries are thinking very much about their rise up in the world, their development and their increasing power. And they have not stepped up yet to their responsibilities as world leaders.
I agree. I agree that, for a country that took pride in being the champion of the colonized, I think our reactions, even in the General Assembly, on the way we have voted, have been very confusing, have sent out mixed signals, despite our consistent position on a two-state solution for Palestine. But Professor Temkin, I would like to ask you, because at the moment, what we are also hearing is that the Arab and Muslim countries, some 57 of them, they are apparently offering a peace deal, saying that they will guarantee security in exchange for a Palestinian state, that the Arab states are really ready for peace. But are we the farthest today possible when you look at the history, the complicated history of this entire conflict, from when peace may perhaps have been possible, given the fact that you have an Israel today whose leadership, I don't think, has an appetite for peace to begin with. I mean, who's going to buy that peace deal? And the Palestinians themselves are so fractured, whether, they have a Fatah, they have a Hamas, then you have the PLA, and the Arab world really is more importantly focusing on diversifying from its oil economy, looking, at its own interests, much like the rest of the world. So are we much, much further away from even looking at a possible solution today than we were, some years ago?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that, look, let's put things in historical perspective. Israel and Egypt have been in peace since the late 1970s. Nothing new there. Israel has had a peace agreement with Jordan since the 1990s. Also nothing new there. Israel has not had a war with Arab nations in decades now. Really, those were Cold War proxy wars, really, when you put them in historical perspective. So the problem is not Israel's relations with the Arab world. The Arab world has, for the most part, really made its peace with the existence of Israel. Not this doesn't mean they necessarily like what Israel is doing now, or the Israeli government, but the Israeli Arab nations don't pose any real threat to Israel, and even Israel doesn't really claim that. They talk about Iran, which is another story, and that's not an Arab country. But the Arab states have been very consistent. I don't think they have great governments or that they are particularly responsible on the world stage, but they've been very consistent that they seek a peaceful coexistence with Israel, and they're willing to guarantee Israel's security and for the need to establish a Palestinian state. And even Saudi Arabia, I'm not a fan of Saudi Arabia by any means, but about 20 plus years ago, they put out a peace plan, which is still there. In my view, it is still the best peace plan that has been put out so far. They have offered it, and the Israelis have rejected it consistently because of the simple fact that it calls for establishing an independent Palestinian state. It's not just a matter of peace, it's a matter of recognizing the Palestinian right to independence, sovereignty, and self-determination, which the current Israeli government, which is a fairly extremist government, it has elements in it, ministers who talk about greater Israel, which really means expanding way beyond where Israel is now in the borders, and they talk about the historic homeland. These are fundamentalists, and quite committed to their ideologies. And that's a big part of the Israeli government now. They are, in fact, the ones who are driving public opinion for these wars, especially the war in Lebanon now. It's part of their larger plan. So I think that, and then of course, Mr. Netanyahu himself has never been a peacemaker. He's on the contrary, he's always been an opponent of the peace process. That's how that's his original rise to power. So that's not where I think the hope comes from. The problem, I think, lies beyond, though. And I think it's fairly clear that Israel itself is not going to initiate peace, and I don't think the Arab countries can force it to. And as you point out, the Palestinians are extremely fractured, divided, beaten down, and Hamas itself, of course, is not a peace-seeking movement. They are quite extremist in their own ideology and violent, as we saw a year ago. So I again look elsewhere. I look at who has the power in the world to try to establish red lines there and to try to drive the peace process. The United States used to do that under presidents, even Clinton, but before that, President Bush, the first President Reagan, President Carter. These are people who led peace negotiations, who put their own credibility on the line in order to kind of force Israel and the Arabs to come together to negotiate. The United States went from being a kind of arbiter in this conflict to being a very gung-ho pro-Israel country, for not because they love, by the way, it has nothing to do with loving Israel or Jewish people, nothing like that. These are internal American political considerations. So they're being very expedient that way. So they've abdicated responsibility for this. And in fact, they are being wildly irresponsible by simply letting their ally be very reckless, using American arms in order to bomb these countries, which in the end will work against American interests in the region. And European countries the same way. Of course, they have especially Western European countries like Germany, France, they are feeling historically guilty for the Jewish Holocaust that happened in World War II. And the way that they kind of try to fix this is by a kind of consistent support for Israel. The problem is that Israel and the Jewish people is not quite the same thing. And the Jewish people who were exterminated in the Holocaust have actually nothing to do with the Israel of today. So they are confusing two different things, and it's very, very destructive for the politics of today. And then again, as I point out, we do see China making declarations that are I would say commonsensical. Like India, by the way, China also sees itself historically as a representative of the colonized world and talk about anti-colonialism as a legitimate struggle. But China is still not assertive in that way. They are still thinking primarily about, what's in our interest? How are we going to get stronger at the expense of the West and the United States? Not behaving like a fully responsible world leader. So it's a massive failure of global leadership. And in the meantime, people are dying.
Absolutely. And, when you look at those statements, whether it's the Pope himself or the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, however well-meaning, they just sound so helpless at this point in time. I'm just going to take a last 10 minutes of your time. I know you have a busy evening, Professor Temkin. You brought up the US leadership, and you're just days, weeks away from electing a new US president. In a recent, in a podcast, I heard you saying that because you look at leadership and leaders as a creation of, a production of time, a production of moments, and you did say that Biden's victory in 2020 was perhaps created out of, it was a product of the Trump era, with Trump coming to power and what happened during his term. How are you looking at these elections right now, and what is driving these elections? Do you really see a leader in the making who can change the course of history?
That's the US elections is one of the most confounding and frustrating things to analyze. And one of the reasons is because the American political system is so bizarre and hard to explain to non-Americans and even to Americans. It's just a strange, take India as a large, complex country, but the political system, I think you can, it actually is logical. The system itself has results that correspond more or less to what the electorate wants. You can make that link, the result of an election with the democratic will of the people. In the United States, that link is a very tenuous link. You can win the popular vote and still lose the presidency, for example. You can be a representative from the most populous state in the union and have just as much power as the representative from the smallest and least populous state in the union, et cetera, et cetera. So the results of the election are hard to predict because you're not just looking at who is more popular. You're looking at all kinds of factors like who will win swing states. These are states that in which the Democrats and Republicans are competitive with each other, whereas there are states that are clearly going to go one way or the other, either Republican or Democrat, because we have the Electoral College in the United States. And so that's why I said we have to analyze the political system that way, and making predictions is very difficult. That being said, I stand by what I said earlier, and that podcast you mentioned, I do think that Joe Biden was elected primarily in 2020 because he was not Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was extremely unpopular at the end of his presidency. Donald Trump has never been a particularly popular person. This is one of the funny things. You can have a president who gets elected with a 40% approval rating on the day of his election. How that happens? Only in America. Same for the opposition. You know, Biden was also not very popular. Now we have a situation where Joe Biden, of course, stepped down because he was shown to be incompetent, which also raises the question of why he's still president, but I leave that aside. I leave that aside for now. So we have the Kamala Harris candidacy, and I think that when she became the candidate, there was a certain rush of enthusiasm, especially among younger voters and Democratic voters, that this was somebody new that they could get behind after they had lost faith in Joe Biden, and would be the person to kind of stave off the challenge again of Donald Trump. The problem in the United States politically, and this is a bit hard to convey, is that the factors that allowed Trump to become president in the first place are still there. They never went away. There are still the political economy of the United States, their relationship to immigration, the problem of inequality in the United States, the very shaky feeling that people have about their economic future, and the list is very long, create a lot of anxieties in the country, and anxieties create all kinds of unpredictable results. So, for example, the arrival of Donald Trump onto the political scene in the first place, and he has that base that supports him. And this base is distributed in a way throughout the Electoral College that allows him to have a chance. So he could very well win the presidency, all while remaining still overall an unpopular candidate. Part of it is also that Kamala Harris is still a bit of a mystery to people. I think she's not, there's a sense that I get in the United States that people are like the idea of her candidacy, but they don't know what she stands for. They don't know what she represents exactly, aside from the fact that she's not Joe Biden and not Donald Trump. So that's why we're seeing really a 50-50. Right now, the race is very close. Kamala Harris has a slight advantage, but again, because of the vagaries of the system, I would be insane to give you a prediction of what I think is going to happen.
It's an election that everybody will very, very closely watch, particularly at a time when the world is in such a tumult. And, clearly when it comes to West Asia, if there's one country that has all the leverage, it is the United States, which we were talking about also. Just a final question,
Yes.
Of course, from the era of Machiavelli, Malcolm X, MLK to Gandhi, the leaders that you talk about in your book, today we are living in the era of social media. We are living in the online world. You're living in a world where an Elon Musk is day in and day out advocating for Donald Trump, on the platform openly, Twitter or X. I mean, it's mainstream media also does endorse presidential candidates in the US, but, for Donald Trump, for Elon Musk to be using this platform, millions of people onto it for advocating. How is big tech changing how leaders and leadership is viewed? Is it shaping up leadership across the world differently today?
That's a good question. Thank you for that. There's two parts to this. One is the whole thing of social media. And overall, I think social media, as opposed to many of my peers and contemporaries, I'm not hostile to social media. I don't think that social media is a bad thing. Overall, I think it's a good thing. It allows people sometimes to get unfiltered information, especially younger people. They get the news. And by the way, in my experience, younger people, at least where I am in the United States, especially younger people are on certain issues are far better informed than their parents and their grandparents, who are getting their news from these sort of, corporate mainstream cable news channels or from the traditional media. So, TikTok and Twitter and other social media, even Instagram, I think are overall, they have the potential to be a source of information and empowerment, not necessarily something sinister and corrupting. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think the big tech problem is the power that it allows, not just the platform, but the owners, the people who control big tech, because it gives them outsized influence. So you mentioned Elon Musk and sort of using his platform to support Trump. I don't think that Elon Musk is going to tip the election either way. I don't think Elon Musk is a particularly liked person, or influence. I don't think people say, "Oh, Elon Musk likes Trump, so I'm going to vote." I don't think it works that way.
But the platform does carry a lot of weightage. It has emerged as an important platform.
Well, you and I use the platform, and I actually like the platform because it allows me to express myself in ways that I couldn't necessarily through more, traditional channels where you have to. This is very unfiltered, and I can talk to my audience very, very directly. So I'll give the platform that. And Twitter, part of the problem is that Elon Musk bought Twitter, which was, until he bought it, the most democratic, kind of empowering platform in the world for media and information. That's really the problem, is that Musk doesn't like that part of Twitter. He wants Twitter to be different from that. That's where I have a problem with him particularly. But I think it's a bigger problem. It's not just a problem of big tech. Think about who is driving American politics. We know that American politics is very donor driven. So some of the people are in tech, but some of them are in industry. Some of them are in the corporate world, and they determine everything from who are political candidates, what policies they're going to pursue, how they're going to vote on important issues. There's a huge gap between what polls show consistently on many issues, including foreign policy, including on healthcare, including on gun control, many things, that the political class produces the complete opposite in a very grotesque way. And you can always show that actually they do that often because it's what their donors want them to do. So my problem in American politics, again, is not specifically about the social media part of it or the owners of tech, but more about where the most wealthy people in society, the most powerful people in the financial world get to decide, sometimes in the place of the actual voters.
Okay. We will leave it there, but I appreciate your time and your insights, Professor Moshik Temkin, for joining me here in this conversation.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
And I think it is very crucial. It is very unfortunate that we do not see the kind of leadership that is needed today amid this entire cycle of violence. And we are only talking about West Asia, but let's not forget, other than, of course, West Asia and Russia, Ukraine, you already have so much of bloodshed happening across Syria, across Yemen, across Afghanistan, the situation in Afghanistan too, that people don't really now care about that much or talk about that much. But these are all stemming because of the vacuum of morality, because of the vacuum of people looking only at self-serving interests. And, perhaps the current history that is there right now, it needs to shape up better leaders. As Professor Temkin also argues in his books, that there are several occasions where it's people and movements, when they form, they also lead to the shaping up of leadership as well. But
absolutely.
I hope to carry on with this conversation in some other episode. But for now, thank you so much for joining us here.
All right. Thank you.
And thanks to everybody.